Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is James Gustave Speth, who is the Dean of the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and Professor in the Practice of Environmental Policy at Yale University. His new book is The Bridge at the Edge of the World: Capitalism, the Environment, and Crossing from Crisis to Sustainability. Dean Speth, welcome to Berkeley.
Happy to be here, Harry.
Where were you born and raised?
A little town in the low country of South Carolina called Orangeburg.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
Well, rather profoundly, I think. My father took me out into the swamps to fish and into the fields to hunt on a regular basis, and I developed a real affection for the out of doors. And my mother was a high school teacher, and she introduced me to the world of books and thinking and writing, and it was quite a very pleasant and stimulating childhood, to tell you the truth. I can't, unlike a lot of people, I can't say a bad thing about my childhood.
And what about education? Did you have high school teachers or college teachers that pointed you in the direction that you finally went?
Well, I went through the public schools of Orangeburg, which at that time, I'm embarrassed to say, were thoroughly segregated. But they were very good schools, all in all, I think. And they steered me towards the sciences because I think the best teachers in the school could have been the science teachers and the math teachers, and they got me very interested. And so when I went off to Yale in 1960, I was pretty sure I wanted to major in science. And
you did that at Yale College, or?
I didn't, actually. I did it for 2 years, and then I decided that I needed a little more roundedness in my education, and I switched over into political science.
And then, was it then inevitable then that you would go to law school in those times?
Well, I think a lot of people have gone to law school in our country who didn't know exactly what they wanted to do with themselves when they finished college, and that was certainly my case.
And at the law school at that time, did you take any course? I mean, was the environment just emerging as a topic?
It hadn't emerged. There were no courses in environment and no courses in environmental law to speak of. People who had interest in these areas took property law and tort law and things like this, administrative law, but there really was no thing called environment even. It was used in a different way then, but it began to emerge during the time I was at law school. And by 1969, we actually, when I graduated from law school, we actually was the same year that the National Environmental Policy Act became law and created the environmental impact statement process. And that was our first piece of legislation in this modern environmental era.
And I noticed in the book that you mentioned Charles Reich, who had taught at Yale and in the 60s wrote a book about the new consciousness. I believe the book was called The Greening of America. Did you have him, or did you only read his book after you were gone from Yale?
No, Charles and I were friends. I was his research assistant as a law student, and I took a course from him and worked with him on a little bit on his book. But that grew mostly out of his undergraduate teaching. He got a little tired of the stodgy law school and began to teach in Yale College, the undergraduate part of Yale. And it turned out to be about the largest course in Yale College. It was very popular, and the 60s were a very interesting period, as we all know.
I'm curious, how did the training in the law school help you as over the years you came to think about the environment as a policy problem? Were there particular skills that you developed in law school that were useful?
Well, I think the critical thing was that while I was at the law school and I began to organize some friends to go create an environmental litigation group, because we were looking for something interesting to do with our legal training. And we didn't really want to go to big law firms. And and we saw this environmental issue emerging. And somewhat opportunistically, we decided to create an environmental legal defense fund. And that ended up, through some long story, being the Natural Resources Defense Council. So by 1970, the year I got out of law school, we were all busy working away within the framework, and we were the Natural Resources Defense Council.
I'm curious, the origin of the ideas, was it really the political activism of the time that was pointing in that direction, or was it people like you who had known and loved the environment as you were growing up, or a combination of all of that?
Well, I think it was a bit of a combination. We obviously were children of the 60s. We were motivated to believe that we could change the world, that we could use government as an instrument to change the world. The part of government that seemed most responsive at that time was the federal government. So we believed that we could create a federal environmental law that would really save the environment.
I noticed in your curricula vitae that you were actually a law clerk to Justice Hugo Black. When did that occur? Was it out? It was after law school, obviously.
Yes.
And tell us a little about that experience, because Justice Black was obviously a pivotal figure in the history of constitutional law.
Yes, he was, and a wonderful, warm man, tough-minded, but very sweet and gentle with his law clerks like me. We basically had this idea of starting what became the Natural Resources Defense Council when we were at law school, but we didn't get it going, and some of us were lucky enough to end up with really unbelievable opportunities, like clerking at the Supreme Court, and in my case with Justice Black. And he was an extraordinary man who at that point in his life had been a justice for a long time, and really knew very clearly what he wanted to do as a justice. And it was like a great force of nature moving through the court, and we were sort of hanging on behind his robes, trying to keep up with him, even at that age. It was quite an experience.
And at that time, I guess no environmental cases had yet come before the court, or not?
Not really.
Yeah.
Not really. They would come very soon thereafter, though. Very soon thereafter. Some of the basic cases about whether citizens could actually access the courts to enforce the laws that were on the book. Could we have citizen suits and things of that nature?
Before we get to the book, I want to talk about the very different roles that you've had after law school. You mentioned one, the Legal Defense Fund for the Environment. You also served as head of the Environmental Council for President Carter, and at the UN as head of the UN Development Program. It's an interesting background for somebody who, in his new book, is making such a radical critique. And I want to talk a little about some of the frustrations and opportunities. I mean, for example, working for President Carter, the environment is on the agenda.
Yes.
So tell us a little about that experience and what you learned from it.
Well, this was a period of great hope. The early 70s, before the Carter administration, actually in the Nixon administration, was a period in which most of our major environmental laws got passed, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and other things. And then in the Carter years, he made the environment a real priority. This was a period of great hope for environmental accomplishment. And I think it set us on a path of that made us believe that if we kept doing what we were doing in the 70s, and if we kept doing that in the 80s and the 90s and on, that in fact we would succeed, because there was such evidence of progress in the 70s. And in a way that deceived us, because what I say in the book is that it's a paradox. We got stronger and more sophisticated as a movement, as a force in society, this whole issue of environment, with more and more groups and more funding and more foundation support and more public support, and yet the environment went downhill. Mm-hmm. And what I set out to try to describe in the book is answer that paradox. How could that have happened?
Mm-hmm. And before we get to the book, let's talk about another role that you had, because you were one of the founders and leader of the World Resources Institute. So you actually also tried working in the non-governmental organization realm.
Well, of course, before the Carter administration and after I was in the NGO world. To give you one example, in the Carter administration, we prepared for the president a report called the Global 2000 Report to the president. It was a look in 1980 at what might eventuate in 2000 if we stayed on the track that we were on, if we didn't change. And it looked at environment and resources and population and development issues. And then after that, we came to some very disturbing conclusions in the Global 2000 Report. That we really were losing forests at a very high rate, that the environment was deteriorating globally. We were building a fool's paradise in the U.S., cleaning up our air and water pollution, while their larger global scale issues pushing the environmental quality steadily downward. And so we undertook, after the Carter administration, to create the World Resources Institute that you mentioned, so that there would be a think tank capacity to address these global scale issues. Mm-hmm. Almost all the environmental groups in the U.S. at that time were focusing on our domestic issues, local, regional issues. But the global scale issues that the U.S. was heavily complicit in also were not being addressed that much, and they weren't really ripe for the kind of advocacy and litigation that you could do on our domestic issues. So we really needed a think tank to open up these issues, to explore them, to bring them to public attention. And that's why the World Resources Institute was created, and we did that right after the Carter administration.
Mm-hmm. And then you actually moved on to the UN, and were at the UN for a good period at the UN Development Program.
Yes.
And you seem to be saying in the book that in essence a lot of what one would try to achieve, your own government, that is the U.S. government, was complicit in often blocking progress. Is that a fair assessment from what you write?
Well, one of the big things that the UN does, the United Nations does, is to help forge treaties. And we now have a major treaty, or sometimes called a convention, on almost all the big environmental issues. We have one on biodiversity loss, on ozone protection, on climate protection, on shipping hazardous chemicals, on the law of the sea, on and on. And the U.S. hasn't signed hardly any of them. Mm-hmm. It has refused to join the Kyoto Protocol. It has refused to join the Biodiversity Convention. There's a convention on toxic chemicals that it hasn't joined. And this is a pattern that goes far beyond the environmental area. So yes, our government has, after a strong start in the 70s on environmental issues, and as I say, mostly domestic at that time, the U.S. kind of lost its way and has been a foot dragger ever since. The U.S. worked hard on the ozone protection issue, the protective ozone shield issue, but after that, it was all downhill, and the U.S. has become one of the most negative forces in international environmental protection, and frankly, we haven't done nearly enough to strengthen our domestic environmental laws and action either. So I have, as I said, My goal was to try to find out why that had happened, why this paradox could occur, and then to, think out loud about what needed to be done.
And before we get into that, and we will in a second, I wanted to walk you through these various roles, because in the end, you have a criticism to make of the environmentalists that you were a part of. And I want to touch on that briefly, because what you're really saying is the way they saw the problem and the actions that they took over these years, and you were party to it, really were inadequate for the problem. So tell us a little about your critique of what you and your fellow environmentalists, the way they saw the problem.
Right. Well, it is certainly a self-critique, as well as a critique of what I call mainstream environmentalism. Basically, as I mentioned earlier, we started out so well with getting laws passed and then litigating to ensure their enforcement and reaching out to the public with some educational messages that we came to see that was really what you needed to do to get the job done. And instead of realizing that we had been checkmated in the 1980s and asking how this could happen, and instead of understanding at a deeper level what was really going on, we just went ahead with the approaches that seemed to work earlier. That is fundamentally what happened, I think. So basically the environmental community in our country, the mainstream groups, opted to work within the system, to use the courts, to use the Congress and the legislatures, to do the things that you're supposed to do as good citizens. And to get the job done. And my conclusion, unfortunately, is that that's not enough. Mm-hmm. That, in fact, we have to change the system.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned this report that you did, and in the book, you walk us through all aspects of the problem, and you remind us of how serious the problems are. And you have a phrase that was really a nice way to put it. The global economy is crashing against the earth. And you go through the list of the measures, and I'll just, climate disruption, the losing of the forest, the losing of the land, the losing of fresh water, losing marine fisheries, toxic pollutants, losing biodiversity, over-fertilizing with nitrogen. So here you are, a person who's really worked at this, and you're looking back, and you're saying categorically, it's not been enough.
Not nearly. We're on the verge of, after all this effort for all these decades of ruining the planet, to put it bluntly. You list those things, Harry, but they're even more striking when you put some numbers on them.
Please do.
Half the forests are gone. 90% of the predator fish in the ocean are gone. 20% of the coral are gone. Another 20% severely threatened. We're fishing the 75% of the ocean fisheries to capacity, or overfishing them right now. We're losing an area about the size of Nebraska to desertification every year. There are dozens of toxic chemicals in each and every one of us with really, unfortunately, unknown effects. And I could go on. It's a whole, the biggest thing we've done, of course, is that we've neglected the climate issue totally. And as a result, we've increased the main greenhouse gas in the atmosphere by a third, by 33%, and started the dangerous process of climate change and global warming. And ice fields everywhere are melting. It is already a huge force for destructive change on a planetary scale, and it will get worse. And we had better get very serious, or it'll be catastrophic.
Now, your fundamental criticism when you begin looking at, hey, well, what is the problem here, is a radical critique of capitalism as we practice it. What I guess I will ask first is, what are the essential features of capitalism that make incorporating concern about the environment impossible?
Well, I think we have to understand this diagnosis, you have to take a step back, and we have to face the fact that economic activity is very destructive of environment. It can be less so or more so. It's more so in China than it is here, a given amount of growth, because they have so few controls, we have more. But over the long term and in general, the more economic activities going on, the more destruction of environment you're going to have. And it's particularly bad where you have the profit motive driving so much of the economic activity. Because what this extraordinary search for profit on the part of large corporations and small does is that it ends up creating environmentally dishonest prices. This drive for profits keeps the companies, drives the companies to want to keep the cost that they're imposing on the environment off of their books. The economists call them externalities. And they want more than anything else to not have to pay for the environmental damages, not to have to pay for the environmental cleanup, and not to have to, and to have, and then in addition to these costs that, say, the polluter who's affecting the downstream user is not paying, they go to Washington or somewhere else and get deep subsidies for energy extraction and other things, and that gets the prices even more dishonest environmentally. So what we have is a market system that's guided largely by prices, and they are environmentally dishonest. How can we even pretend to be trying to do something about the environment when we live in a market system and we have prices which are so unreflective of environmental needs, environmental values, environmental scarcities? So that's basically, and then we prop this system up dramatically with in this three-legged stool. And one of the stools is enormous power of the corporate community. Corporations have grown more powerful with the process of globalization, and they are now not only the most powerful economic actors in the system, they're now the most powerful political actors in our system, and making it doubly difficult for our political process to deal with these issues, because they want those profits. The whole nature of capitalism is to make profits, to invest a large portion of those profits, and to grow and to innovate. And as the economists will say, you got to view capitalism as an enormously successful growth machine, and that's what it is and what it's best at. So that's one stool, the corporations. Another stool is us. I mean, we are pathetic capitulation to, we are a pathetic capitulation to materialism, commercialism, consumerism, and it reigns supreme in our lives. I don't pretend to be out of this picture at all. I'm as guilty as the next person, maybe more so in some ways. I try, but I'm spending a lot of money, and I know my environmental footprint is pretty big. And so we've lost touch with the things that really matter. And we think we are, the best way to improve our lives is to own more things, to possess more things. And we possess so many things now, so much stuff, that we've had to create a self-storage industry because we have no place to put it all. And the self-storage industry now in the United States in just a few decades has grown to the point that it's big enough to cover the island of Manhattan and the entire city of San Francisco, just in self-storage square footage. So we have this affluenza that we need to recover from. And then the third leg on this stool is the state or our government. It desperately needs growth. It can't grow much itself, in the sense of the economy, so it has to give the corporations what they need to grow, and it does. We have Basically, if the country's growing, then that's viewed as a political success. The government can point to all the growth they were having as a solution to our problems, even though it really hasn't solved the problems. And without raising taxes, revenues will go up. So the government loves growth, they'll do anything. And so you've got this system that has all these elements in it. And it's also at the same time replicating technologies that were developed at a point where nobody cared much about the environment. And it's replicating these technologies over and over again and resisting changing them. And the internal combustion engine has got to be a prime example of that, but there are lots and lots. And this system has now grown phenomenally large. It's hard to believe how big it is now and how big it's becoming. It took all of history to grow the $7 trillion world economy of 1950. All of human history. Finally got it up to $7 trillion in 1950. How long does it take to add another $7 trillion today? In constant dollars, the same dollars. Less than a decade. Less than a decade. When I went to Yale in 1960, I went to Yale in 1960. Since then, the world economy has doubled in size and then doubled again. It's quadrupled. And it's doing the same thing now. It will quadruple or quintuple by mid-century in our century. It's the doubling time of the world economy today is about 17 years. Just last year it was 15 years because we were growing at about 5% a year in the world economy. So this is an amazing thing. Imagine this huge amount of economic activity, and it's doubling very fast, and pulling along with it an enormous environmental consequence.
Let's look at these different legs and see where ultimately you want to go. But first, let's talk about this corporate leg, because you're really very clearly saying that the corporations really can't reform themselves, and that when they move in the direction of being environmental friendly, it's not enough, that the pace of change here and of destruction of the environment is so great. Talk a little about that.
Well, I think the corporations and many of the people in the corporations realize that they need government, they need action at a level because they cannot act on their own. If they are bound by law and by the pressures of the market, the financial market, to generate ever larger profits for the benefit of their shareholders. That is pretty fundamental, this notion of shareholder primacy. And so the only way a corporation can do good is by doing well. And this puts them in a situation where they don't have a lot of freedom. They can dress it up. They can make some stabs in the right direction. But basically, they have to perform for their shareholders. So what I propose in the book is not really original with me, because there are a number of people who are working on this issue, and that is to recognize that corporations should be beholding and should be governed by all the shareholders, all the stakeholders that contribute to its wealth creation. And that means the communities and labor, and it even means some representation of future generations as well as suppliers. And so you need and I think if we moved in that direction, as well as did some other things that I think we need to do, we would be in effect rechartering corporations with a broader public purpose.
And you list the elements of what a corporation is, and you're really saying that those elements have to be drastically changed. Everything from the separation of ownership from management, limited liability, personhood, what the definition of the best interests of the corporation, all of that needs to be changed. That's pretty radical prescription.
Yeah, I guess it is. the limited liability, I wonder why, I would like to see some cases in which, even the owners of the company could be held liable for very egregious corporate performance. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I've talked about the sort of shareholder primacy as an objective of the only real objective of the corporation is to maximize shareholder value. But the one I haven't talked about is this very interesting case of the personhood of the corporation. What we mean by that, of course, is that our constitutional law has recognized corporations as citizens, protected by the Bill of Rights and protected by the corporation. It's a very strange development because the provisions that they used, the Supreme Court used in the 1890s in the Santa Clara County case to do that were provisions that were put in the Constitution to protect the newly freed slaves of our country and be sure that they had the rights. They weren't put in there to protect corporations, but they've done that. And now when you try to regulate the advertising or the involvement in politics of a corporation, they say, oh, we have First Amendment rights as a company. Now, the individuals in there should have First Amendment rights, but why should these companies, with all their wealth and all their power, have First Amendment rights? That wasn't put in the Constitution to protect these people, these organizations. These organizations are fictional creatures created by states, in our case, and are chartered to go forth in the world and do something. And we can change how we charter them.
Mm-hmm. Now, you are somebody who's steeped in the law, who must know a lot about politics because of the jobs that you have held. And what do you see as the key to moving in the direction of this radical redefinition that you're talking about?
Well, I think it's let's put it this way. If you think it seems radical today, wait until tomorrow. Mm-hmm. Because things are driving us to think about the world differently. And the ideas that seem radical or far-fetched today are not going to seem that way tomorrow. And what I've tried to do in the book is to sketch some of the directions that I think we need to be examining now and getting ready for these changes. The real utopian fantasy. Somebody say, well, you're utopian, you think these things do. No, the real utopian fantasy is to believe that we can keep doing exactly what we're doing, that we can continue on business as usual. And and the pragmatic necessity, I would say, is the deep change. So this is not your usual formulation. I think in the short term, to deal with environmental issues, we've got to go with what we've got. And what we've got is we know how to for example, cap greenhouse gas emissions, and we've done that with sulfur emissions to protect us from acid rain. We can do that for greenhouse gas emissions to protect us from climate change. So I think that what I've tried to describe are the next steps, not the things we need to do tomorrow or right after we get a new president elected, but what we need to be building towards if we really are serious about leaving a pleasant environment and a sustaining environment to our children and grandchildren.
You quote at one point Milton Friedman as saying, only crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When the crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depends on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them live and available until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable. Your suggestion in your discussion of environmental economics is that there are ideas out there that will, when the crisis hits, when this future you're talking about makes these things apparent, that they will be there to be implemented.
Yes, I think that's right. And I didn't agree with Milton Friedman on many of the things that positions he took or things that he wrote, but that one I agree with. And I think that's right. And so there's room for hope here because the situation will change and will make us face these issues. The trick really is to face them quickly enough, not to postpone the inevitable for too long, which is pretty close to what we've done with the climate issue right now. We have no time left to deal with the climate issue. So I think that if we crisis produces change. I think people agree with this. I think that's pretty widely accepted. Now, what does that mean in this case? Well, it means, I hope what it means is that we can create a virtual crisis. We can create a sufficient warning, system of warning, a sufficient foreshock, if you will, in some way, so that people anticipate rather than experience a real crisis. But if we don't, well, we'll probably get some crises of different types, and it could be quite disturbing, like very serious sea level rise or something of that type. So I think that that's one thing. The other thing that can drive real change, in my view, is a real movement, a real social movement in our country. And in the book, I call for a fusion of people who are concerned about environment, who are concerned about social justice, and who are concerned about the fraying of our democracy, the erosion of popular control, the fusion of these interests and groups of concern into a very strong grassroots movement that can drive real change.
One of the background issues that you're trying to address is the problem of equality and inequality throughout the world and so on. And I think it's important that you respond to the argument that the inequalities in the United States, increasingly so, but worldwide, are so great. And so a key problem becomes the management of, so to speak, spreading the wealth while slowing down the costs that we're creating in creating that wealth. Talk a little about that problem, because that's something this political movement will have to address.
Well, we've had tremendous growth in per capita income and total economic output for decades. It's slowing up now with this recession. It may even have stopped. It may even, if it's a real recession, it'll go negative for a while. But still, we're way up here. And, has that been translated into better lives for people? Most people don't think so. If you look while this GDP per capita has gone up and up and up, the level of satisfaction with life that people report, the level of human happiness that people report, has been flatlined for decades. So we're not translating all this growth into perceived well-being on the part of people. And also, it is not being translated into greater social equality either. Real wages haven't gone up during this period. And if you look at indicators of social well-being in our society, whether it's drugs or alcoholism or incarceration rates or disintegrating families or school levels or unemployment, we haven't made real progress. We're not taking this wealth and putting it into improving the people's lives. So I think there's almost a perverse thing going on. We're throwing all this aggregate economic growth and claiming and offering it as a solution to these problems. If we really want to solve the problems, in my judgment, we should stop worrying so much and putting so much emphasis on growing the economy overall, and start growing those things that we really care about, and investing in people, and investing in saving the environment. And we're rich enough to kind of let go a bit and move into a post-growth society where growing the economy doesn't trump everything else.
Mm-hmm. You make a point about America that I think is very important and needs to be emphasized, and that one of the reasons for our being taken with the drug of economic growth is that growth is the way America reconciles the contradiction of liberty and equality. That's really very important, and it's something that this political movement would have to address.
Yes, well, that is what we've seen it that way. I don't think it's actually reconciled it very well. And in fact, for reasons I was just stating. I mean, if in fact we had this growth, and we had and that growth was making everybody happier, and we had and higher levels of life satisfaction, and all this consumption that was really fulfilling to people. And we were closing the gaps between the rich and the poor, and providing economic opportunity to the middle class. Well, then, we'd be in a hell of a fix from an environmental point of view, because people then would say, well, I'm not so worried about the environment because all these other wonderful things are happening with all this growth. But the truth is that that's not what's happening with the growth. And and on top of that, we're getting a lot of environmental problems. So my friend Herman Daly says, well, what we really have is uneconomic growth. Economic growth that is costing us, if we could cost it all out, more than it's benefiting us at this point. Now, this is really only true in rich countries like the U.S. Lord knows most of the world needs to grow.
You quote Moynihan, who says the central conservative truth is that culture, not politics, determines the success of society. The central liberal truth is that politics can change a culture and save it from itself. And you're saying we have to do that. Now, there are two elements to what you're proposing. One is there has to be a real change in consciousness. How does that come about? Is it through books like yours, but something beyond that?
I tried to ask a lot of knowledgeable people when I was preparing the book. I would ask, if we need a national conversion experience, if we need some deep change in our values and our outlook on life quickly, what could do that? And a lot of them came back and said, well, a calamity. In the personal world, a personal calamity can do that. The loss of a child in Iraq or something, it could do that. So we're very likely to have some foreshocks. And if we get like Katrina, if we have events that really make us think, and they occur in a time of wise leadership, and the leader can talk to the American people in a way that links our traditional values and the best of what we've stood for over the years with the new direction that we need to go in. And there's a new story, a new narrative that we can all, relate to and understand. And we back that up with some sophisticated social marketing and talking to the public about these issues. If we get the confluence of those circumstances, and meanwhile there is this social movement that I was talking about, which is fundamentally a process of consciousness raising. If all these things can come together, I think we can get real value change in our society and get real momentum going. But we have to redefine what we think about progress, what we think progress is. We've got to be honest about what is truly making people happy, which is fundamentally their relationships with other people and giving, not getting. Over and over again, this is what the studies say. So we've just got to kind of disengage from this hyperventilating lifestyle and take it slow and start re-relating to ourselves, our communities, our families, our country. We've tuned out the politics. Third of the people vote in off-year elections, a half in presidential election years. It's scandalous, but it's not because these people are dumb or stupid or don't care. It's because there's something wrong with the system, and it's not delivering. Mm-hmm. And when you have a country where 1% of the total adult population is in jail, mm-hmm. There's something going on. It's not just that 1% that's got a problem. Mm-hmm. The society has a problem, and of course, I believe it's like a third of all African American males will be in the penal justice system at some time in their lives. Mm-hmm. Amazing. There's something wrong with the system, the society that we need to be dealing with when you've got numbers like that. We can't just keep locking everybody up. A third of the people in the country say they have nobody to go to talk when they have a serious problem. So there's some deep social issues that we need to address, and right now we're very cavalier about all that. Very cavalier. We're not doing it, and so I think that in essence these communities, environmental community of people who are worried about their communities and social justice issues and mental health issues and education issues and health care issues and job security issues, we're all in the same boat. We're not that way in Washington because everybody's in their own silo. But the truth is that this system that we're trying to work in of political economy cares about profits and growth. It doesn't really care about these issues, and it's up to us as citizens to use our democracy to inject these concerns about people and nature and community into the system. And right now, we're too enfeebled, and the system is so much in control mm-hmm. of the corporate community and the wealth holders in our society, and increasingly so, that we're not making that translation of real human values, real concern about each other, real concern about nature, into our politics and into our political system and into our laws and behaviors in the end. So it's a big challenge, but we've got to do it.
Well, what does leadership look like that will seize the initiative here? Or are you saying that really leadership isn't that important? It's really what comes up from the grassroots?
Well, I think it's both. I mentioned earlier that if you had a grassroots movement that was raising issues and other factors were pushing issues to the forefront, and we had wise leadership, Professor Howard Gardner at Harvard has written a book called Changing Minds, and he talks about the important role of leaders in complex systems. So I think it's both. We need. And I don't want to be political, but I actually think that this is one of the reasons that people think Barack Obama is such an interesting mm-hmm. candidate, because whatever you might think of him versus the other two people in the field, he seems to be the person who could talk to us in a way that might inspire us to our best. To our best.
Mm-hmm. In the evolution of your career, are there key turning points when you landed where you land in this book, or is it just sort of the culmination of all that you were seeing in attempting to make change in very limited spheres and seeing that it wasn't enough?
Well, I think it's reflecting on the whole period. I'm 66 now. I've been around since this modern environmental era started in the late 60s. I've been party to the whole thing. I've seen a lot of the world in the UN, and as I mentioned, we started out very hopeful. We started out very optimistic, but if you look at the facts, we're not winning. We're not succeeding. And so if you ask if there's something, big, it's the opportunity I've had to sort of step back since I joined the academic community at Yale, to step out of the fray, if you will, and the fight, and reflect on that period, and to develop some data, and think hard about it, and start to teach it at the university, which, as you know, makes you think very hard about what you want to say and what you have and what you really believe. So I'm very appreciative of the opportunity that I had at Yale, to take this reflective look at this period.
Are you surprised by how radical you have become in terms of the ideas that you now have about how systemic the change is?
Well, they don't look that radical to me. I mean, they look difficult to me. But I'm not proposing overthrowing the government or expropriating private property or dropping out totally of society and walking away. So to me, it's more of a logical extension of what we started, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and the next place we have to go. And my disappointment in myself, frankly, is that it's taken me so long to come to these conclusions.
How would you advise students to prepare for a future in which these issues are going to become more and more pressing, and in which they may have to get politically involved if their world, the future world, and you're very concerned in this book about future generations, if they want to be part of the change that's necessary?
Well, I think that young people need to take back their world before it's too late. We're in the process now of hollowing out our own real selves, giving ourselves over to these manufactured identities out of television advertising pitches. We're hollowing out nature. We're hollowing out our community, our society. And young people are we really need the young people of this world to take back these things before it's too late. And if there's one period in our history and living memory, so to speak, that in which we had the kind of uprising of nonviolence, could have been all nonviolence, it was the civil rights movement of the 60s. And I would urge young people to look back at that period for a model of what we need today. People put themselves on the line. People took risks, so I think we need to be in the footsteps of Dr. King today. 40 years later, 40 years after his assassination.
Well, on that note, I think you've pointed for a future direction for the next generation. I want to thank you for coming on our program, for writing this book. Let me show it again, The Bridge at the Edge of the World. And it's a bridge, so there's a place to go into the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate this opportunity, Harry.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.